At 2:17 a.m. on June 14, 1944, deep in the black waters of the Pacific near the Caroline Islands, Chief Petty Officer Raymond Haskins stood in the forward torpedo room of the USS Tang, listening to the rhythmic creaks of the submarine's hull. Above him, the faint groans of metal against pressure were the only sounds breaking the suffocating silence. Every man aboard knew what that sound meant: the ocean pressing in, waiting for a single mistake. Haskins' gloved hands hovered near a spool of hemp rope tied crudely around the torpedo loading system, a temporary measure that was never meant to exist in the Navy's official manuals. But for weeks that rope had been the only thing standing between life and death. Raymond Haskins wasn't supposed to be aboard the Tang. He'd been a maintenance engineer stationed at Pearl Harbor, specializing in hydraulic and firing systems. But by the spring of 1944, reports had reached the Pacific Fleet Command of a silent killer among their own submarines. Not Japanese depth charges, not sonar nets, but their own torpedoes. The Mark 18 electric torpedo, hailed as the Navy's technological triumph, had begun turning back on the very submarines that launched them. Circular runs, the crews called them, a malfunction so rare and unpredictable that most dismissed it as superstition. Yet the number of submarines that never returned kept growing. The Tullabee, the Tang's sister boat, had gone down that march under mysterious circumstances. Survivors later said they'd heard their own torpedo coming back before the explosion. When Haskins arrived at Mare Island to inspect the wreckage of torpedo components retrieved from failed missions, he noticed something that the engineers and officers hadn't. The firing linkage between the gyroscope and rudder control, a delicate mechanism that determined the torpedo's course, was subject to micro-vibrations during launch. It wasn't a design flaw per se. It was a tolerance issue, one that the rough seas and hasty wartime production made worse. The electric propulsion system transmitted these subtle oscillations back through the control arm, occasionally resetting the gyro's neutral position by just a few degrees. A deviation of 3 degrees at launch meant a full circle in less than 2 minutes, straight back toward the sub. But the Bureau of Ordnance wouldn't listen. The Mark 18 was their pride, the first American electric torpedo, reverse-engineered from captured German G7E models. It left no wake, made no noise, and was supposedly flawless. Pilot error, they said in every report. Improper maintenance. Haskins knew better. He'd seen too many clean logs, too many disciplined crews with perfect launch records vanish into nothing. He'd spent nights in the hangars of Pearl, watching the torpedo elevators rattle from the vibrations of the compressors, and thinking about that tiny arm, the one piece that wasn't absorbing shock the way it should. By May 1944, he'd had enough. When the Tang came in for resupply before her next patrol, Haskins requested temporary transfer under the pretext of testing vibration-dampening materials. What he brought aboard wasn't an approved part or any sanctioned equipment. It was a bundle of naval-grade hemp rope and a few yards of rubber gasket scavenged from the motor pool. His plan was as unorthodox as it was desperate: to bind the gyro arm assembly with tightly wound rope, stabilizing the linkage against the high-frequency tremors during the launch sequence. It wouldn't change the function. It would just absorb what the engineers on shore refused to acknowledge existed. That night, while the rest of the crew slept, Haskins worked under the dim red lamps of the torpedo room. The air was thick with oil and metallic dust. The rope scratched his hands as he wound them in tight layers around the housing, pulling with all his strength until his knuckles bled. He double-knotted every turn, checking alignment, whispering quiet curses at the manuals that told him to leave it as is. If the inspectors saw this, he'd be written up, possibly court-martialed. But if he didn't do it, he was certain they'd be dead before the month was out. Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, the Tang's skipper, was a man of precision. He trusted his crew, especially the quiet ones who didn't talk much but kept everything running. Haskins was one of those men. The next morning, O'Kane glanced at the improvised binding and raised an eyebrow. "You sure about this, Chief?" he asked. Haskins nodded. "Sir, if it doesn't work, we won't live long enough to regret it." That was the end of the discussion. The Tang set out on her 5th war patrol on June 15th, heading toward the Luzon Strait, an area swarming with Japanese convoys and destroyers. The boat carried 24 torpedoes, half of them Mark 18s. The crew called them ghostfish for their silent trails, but whispers had turned them into omens. The last time a sub had used only Mark 18s, none had returned. Every man in that cramped steel coffin knew it, even if no one said a word. On the 3rd night of patrol, the sonar operator picked up the faint pulse of a convoy at 15,000 yards. O'Kane ordered the approach submerged. The air grew stale, the temperature rising as the boat descended. Sweat dripped onto control panels. In the forward room, Haskins watched as the torpedoes were armed, the rope binding glistening with condensation. The order came down. "Fire one." The hydraulic launch hissed and the Mark 18 slipped silently into the blackness. Haskins held his breath, counting the seconds. 30, 45. Then the dull, distant thud of detonation. Cheers rippled through the sub. First hit confirmed. O'Kane's grin was brief. He gave the order for a second shot. "Fire two." The next torpedo left the tube smoother than any launch Haskins had ever seen. The vibration he'd come to dread wasn't there. The room was steady. Even the gauges seemed calmer, steadier. When the second explosion came, another direct hit. He exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. No circular run, no warning buzz, just silence and success. The rest of the patrol blurred into legend. The Tang went on to sink 5 enemy ships in a single night, a record that would later earn O'Kane the Medal of Honor. But behind every shot fired was a piece of rope, hidden beneath the layers of machinery, doing the work that no official engineer had authorized. Word spread quietly among submariners. When other boats docked beside the Tang, their crews would ask, "What's that binding on your gyro housing?" Haskins would shrug and say, "Keeps her steady." Soon, coils of rope began disappearing from supply rooms across the Pacific. But in those first few nights after the modification, no one knew if it was a miracle or a fluke. Haskins barely slept. Each launch felt like tempting fate, testing whether his crude solution could stand up to the chaos of war. The smell of salt and diesel mixed with his anxiety. He kept checking the knots during every quiet moment, tightening them, whispering under his breath. If anyone noticed, they didn't say a thing. In the world beneath the waves, superstition and survival were the same language. By the end of June, the Tang's patrol log showed something unusual. No misfires, no erratic runs, perfect strike ratios. When reports reached Pearl Harbor, officers chalked it up to exceptional crew discipline. No one asked why. No one wanted to. The Bureau of Ordnance would not admit that the deadliest problem in the Navy's submarines had been solved by a piece of rope. And Haskins, sitting on the floor of the torpedo room with grease-stained hands, knew he'd never tell them either. He wasn't after recognition. He just wanted his crew to come home. In the silence after each mission, he'd glance at the rope, frayed but holding, and think of all the men lost before. The Tullaby, the Trout, the Robelo, each sunk by the arrogance of engineers who never had to watch the sea close over their heads. That night, as the Tang surfaced to recharge batteries, moonlight broke through scattered clouds, glinting off the conning tower. Haskins stepped onto the deck, feeling the cool wind for the first time in days. Somewhere below, in the belly of the sub, the rope he'd tied still held tight, silent, unseen, saving lives. By mid-July 1944, the Tang was already being whispered about among submarine crews in Fremantle and Pearl. 5 enemy freighters destroyed, 2 patrols with no misfires, and a reputation for precision that defied the odds. Officially, it was credited to impeccable maintenance standards. Unofficially, no one could explain why the Tang's Mark 18 torpedoes, notorious for erratic steering and deadly circular runs, suddenly behaved like they'd been redesigned overnight. In the cramped engineering room of the submarine base at Pearl, Chief Petty Officer Haskins sat hunched over a workbench, wiping the salt from his tools, pretending not to hear the officers arguing about statistical anomalies. He knew that statistics had nothing to do with it. It was friction, vibration, and a few turns of rope that had done what the Bureau of Ordnance could not. The Navy's official engineers had spent months drafting reports to defend their weapon. The Mark 18's flaws were dismissed as operational errors, inadequate lubrication, or misaligned gyro vanes. The truth was buried under bureaucratic layers and pride. No one wanted to admit that a torpedo built from captured German blueprints and rushed into mass production might have a fatal flaw. It was supposed to be the great equalizer against the Japanese Navy. Silent, electric, invisible. But Haskins had seen what silence could cost. He'd read after-action reports filled with identical last entries. Fired at convoy. Explosion heard astern. Depth charges followed. No further contact. Each line was like a gravestone carved into the paper. When the Tang returned from its 5th patrol, her success was impossible to ignore. Engineers swarmed the submarine at dock, taking notes, measuring equipment, cataloging wear and tear. They photographed the tubes, the firing systems, and even the markings on the torpedoes. No one thought to look under the rope binding on the gyro assemblies. Haskins watched them work, standing off to the side with his arms crossed, hiding a faint smile. He'd reinforced the bindings before the sub docked, replacing the older ropes with fresh ones, not to deceive, but to protect the secret until it could save others. It was never about credit, it was about time. He remembered the day he first realized the danger wasn't mechanical failure but a design oversight. Months earlier, he'd examined a recovered gyro from the sunken Tullaby's wreckage. The brass housing was intact, but the control rod showed signs of microfracturing, patterns consistent with sustained vibration, not impact. It confirmed what he'd suspected. The constant humming resonance of the launch tube and the torpedo's own motor were throwing off calibration mid-launch, and because the system lacked a shock-absorbing interface, the gyro interpreted those tremors as steering input. The result? A weapon that thought it was obeying its orders by turning, recalculating, and ultimately looping back. When he tried to report his findings, his superior at Mare Island told him, "You're overthinking it, Haskins. The war doesn't wait for perfection." That phrase would haunt him for months. The war doesn't wait for perfection, as if human lives were just the acceptable margin of error for paperwork that couldn't be corrected in time. So he made his own correction. Back on the Tang, that correction had already started spreading without his knowledge. The crew of the Cobia visited while both submarines were docked for refit, and one of their machinist's mates noticed the tightly bound cords around the torpedo housing. "What's that for?" he asked. "Keeps the linkage from singing," Haskins replied casually, using the old mechanics term for vibrating metal. The man nodded, curious. A week later, Haskins heard that the Cobia's machinist had done the same, using strips of canvas instead of rope. When their next patrol ended with all torpedoes functioning perfectly, rumors turned into quiet belief. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to keep the Mark 18s from turning back, but no one dared write it down. The submarine force lived and died on unspoken rules. Innovations that came from the deck plates rarely reached the desks of admirals. Field fixes existed in the shadows, undocumented, deniable, passed by word of mouth and trust. Some mechanics whispered of the rope trick like it was folklore, a superstition to keep death away. Haskins never corrected them. Let them believe in luck, if it made them careful. By August, the Tang was preparing for another patrol, this time toward Formosa. The sea had grown rougher, and Japanese countermeasures were becoming brutal. Improved sonar, relentless patrol planes, and the dreaded Type 93 long lance torpedo, faster and deadlier than anything the Americans had. Every advantage mattered. Haskins tightened his bindings again, double-checking the tension. His fingers trembled as he worked. He'd learned to feel the subtle give of the fibers. Too tight, and they'd fray. Too loose, and the vibration would return. The rope, once white, had turned dark with oil and sweat, a small relic of defiance against the bureaucracy that had failed so many crews. That night, before diving, O'Kane approached him in the dim light of the control room. "You still running your little experiment, Chief?" Haskins nodded. O'Kane gave a faint smile. "Good. Don't tell me what it is. Just keep my fish straight." That was all he said. There was mutual respect between them, the kind forged only in silence and shared danger. On August 24, 1944, the Tang engaged a Japanese convoy off the coast of China. The sea was black with oil slicks from previous battles, and the smell of cordite still lingered in the air. The radar picked up a target, a transport ship escorted by 2 destroyers. O'Kane ordered periscope depth. The crew moved with rehearsed precision. Haskins' hands hovered over the panel as the first torpedo slid into the tube. He glanced at the rope one last time before giving the all-clear. Fire 1. The torpedo launched cleanly. No shudder, no vibration. Fire 2. Another perfect release. Moments later, 2 thunderous explosions echoed through the water. The sonar man called out, "Hits confirmed! Target down!" But then, a sudden tremor. The unmistakable ping of enemy sonar locking onto their position. The destroyers were coming. The Tang dove hard, descending to 200 feet. Depth charges thundered above them, shaking the hull. Dust and paint flakes rained from the ceiling. Haskins braced himself against the bulkhead, eyes locked on the gauges. The engines whined. One more near miss and the pressure hull could buckle. He whispered to himself, "Hold together, hold together." When the barrage finally stopped, only the sound of creaking metal and the distant rush of the ocean remained. The Tang survived. Later, when they surfaced under cover of night, O'Kane put a hand on Haskins's shoulder. "Whatever you did in there, Chief, keep doing it. It was the closest thing to an official endorsement he'd ever get. Within weeks, reports of improved torpedo reliability began filtering through the Pacific Fleet. No formal explanation was ever given, but word spread quietly from boat to boat. Wrap the gyro linkage, cushion the vibration, and your fish will run true. By September, it had become an open secret among submarine mechanics, a ritual of safety. Some used rope, others strips of rubber hose, even silk from parachutes. Each boat had its version, and all swore it worked, but not a single report mentioned it in writing. The Navy's bureaucracy didn't want field improvisation muddying its records, and so, the invention remained invisible, like the man who made it. Haskins never wrote to his wife about what he'd done. His letters home were simple: talk of the weather, the crew, and the hope of coming back. "It's steady work," he'd say, "and the sea's been kind to us." But every time he looked at the coil of spare rope by his bunk, he knew how fragile that kindness really was. War had a way of forgetting the men who kept the machines alive. When the Tang departed for her final patrol in October 1944, the mood aboard was both confident and heavy. They were legends now, the most successful submarine in the Pacific, but legends rarely lasted long in war. As they slipped beneath the waves once more, Haskins checked the bindings on each torpedo a final time. He didn't know it yet, but the sea was about to collect its due. Somewhere in those dark waters, beneath the roar of engines and the weight of silence, a simple rope was still holding, the same rope that had defied orders, saved crews, and changed the course of submarine warfare. Even if history would never know his name, October 24, 1944, at 5:42 p.m., and the Tang was stalking a Japanese convoy west of Formosa, running just below the surface. Sea calm and dim under a fading red sky. The patrol had already been extraordinary. More ships sunk than any other submarine in the Pacific. Commander Richard O'Kane's reputation had become the stuff of naval legend. But inside the boat, superstition ruled stronger than medals. The men avoided saying the word luck. They rubbed the same bolts before battle, wore the same shirts through patrols. And deep inside the forward torpedo room, Chief Petty Officer Raymond Haskins checked the knots on the bindings that no one dared question anymore. They'd frayed slightly at the edges from weeks of heat and salt, but they still held firm. The smell of oil and sweat filled the room. Every surface was slick with condensation. Haskins crouched near the hydraulic manifold, wiping his hands on a rag blackened with grease. He'd been with the Tang long enough to sense when a launch was coming before the order arrived. The hum of preparation, the way voices grew quieter, the shift of boots on the deck plates, it all spoke the same language of expectation. Above, O'Kane was lining up another target through the periscope. 2 tankers and a destroyer escort. Set depth 12 feet, ready tubes 1 through 6. The voice came through the intercom, calm but sharp. Haskins repeated the order mechanically, eyes flicking to the torpedo tubes. 6 Mark 18s, their dull gray shells marked with scuffs from loading. Every one of them wrapped with the same hidden safeguard, that same piece of rope the Bureau of Ordnance would never acknowledge existed. Each knot tied by hand. Each one, he thought, a promise. Fire one. The launch shuddered through the hull. A faint hiss, a mechanical heartbeat, and then silence. Seconds later, the explosion came, low and deep. A tanker breaking apart. Cheers erupted up and down the sub. Fire two. Another hiss, another tremor. A second explosion followed. Closer, sharper. 2 ships down. Then came the sound every submariner both lived for and feared. The angry ping of sonar, echoing back like a pulse of vengeance. The destroyer had them. The Tang dove. The hull groaned as it descended into darkness. The lights flickered as depth charges rolled off enemy decks above them. Each explosion rocked the boat like a fist hitting steel. Dust fell from the ceiling. Gauges rattled. The smell of ozone filled the air. "Hold it 200 feet, shouted the diving officer. "Steady," Haskins called, gripping a handrail as another charge detonated overhead. The sound was deafening. Somewhere in the aft compartment, a pipe burst, spraying steam. But the Tang was built like a predator. She survived what would have crushed lesser subs. Hours later, after the sea calmed and the destroyers gave up, the crew exhaled as one. They'd lived through another gauntlet, and Haskins' bindings, soaked and blackened, had once again kept the torpedoes true. When dawn came, the ocean looked calm again, like nothing had ever happened. O'Kane surfaced to recharge batteries. The smell of salt and diesel filled the conning tower. Men laughed, smoked, and wrote letters they'd never send. It felt like the war had paused, just for a moment. But that night, fate turned back on them. At 1:41 a.m., October 25th, the Tang made her final attack. 2 Japanese transports, unescorted, moving slowly under the moonlight. Easy prey. O'Kane ordered a surface attack. 5 torpedoes, fired in quick succession. The first 4 hit perfectly. The 9th torpedo of the patrol, left the tube without hesitation. Haskins watched the gauge steady, heard the hydraulic hiss, felt that brief, reassuring silence that followed every launch. Then something different. A vibration that shouldn't have been there. Faint but wrong. He froze. The sonar operator called out, "Runs true. Wait, sir, it's turning." In the control room, O'Kane raised his head sharply. "Say again?" "Sir, torpedo's turning. Coming back." The words sliced through the air. For an instant, no one moved. Then chaos. "All ahead flank. Hard right rudder," O'Kane shouted. The engines roared. The submarine heeled violently to port. Inside the torpedo room, Haskins felt the deck tilt beneath him as tools clattered to the floor. He knew what was coming. The sound, a high, fast mechanical whine growing louder, was unmistakable. Then, the world became white. The Mark 18 struck the Tang's stern. The explosion ripped through the aft compartments, tearing steel, extinguishing lights, and hurling men off their feet. A blast of compressed air and smoke filled the corridors. The submarine pitched downward. Alarms wailed. "Seal compartments! Get those hatches shut!" someone screamed. Haskins stumbled through the haze, choking on fumes. He could barely see. The roar of rushing water echoed from aft. The compartment was flooding fast. The Tang listed, her bow rising. He reached for the ladder, climbing toward the control room, one hand pressed against his bleeding forehead. He knew it wasn't the rope. The bindings were intact. They always had been. This was something else. A mechanical error, a cursed coincidence, or maybe just war's cruel symmetry. In the control room, O'Kane was giving the order to abandon ship. "Get topside, now." The Tang began to sink stern first. Men scrambled through smoke and darkness, struggling to reach the conning tower. Haskins helped a young seaman push open a jammed hatch, both of them coughing, lungs burning. The cold Pacific rushed in, black and merciless. He looked back one last time before climbing through the hatch. The torpedo room, his kingdom, his burden, was vanishing under the rising water. The ropes he'd tied still glistened faintly under the emergency light, half submerged, as if watching him leave. He made it to the deck. The sea was chaos, burning oil slicks, men shouting, debris everywhere. He dove into the water just before the sub slipped under completely. The suction pulled at him like an invisible hand, dragging him down. He kicked, hard, lungs screaming until he broke the surface. All around him, cries for help cut through the night, and then silence. Only 9 men from the Tang would survive. Haskins was not among them. When the Japanese picked up the survivors the next morning, O'Kane was one of them. Exhausted, half blinded by the blast, he sat on the deck of the enemy ship, watching smoke rise over the horizon. He said nothing. In the weeks that followed, imprisoned and questioned, he would replay that night endlessly. The last launch, the returning torpedo, the explosion that ended it all. Yet in the silence of his cell, one image kept returning to him. Haskins in the torpedo room, hands black with grease, tying knots with the patience of a man who knew he'd never be mentioned in a report. After the war, when O'Kane was freed and decorated with the Medal of Honor, he gave interviews about the Tang's exploits. He spoke of strategy, courage, and the brotherhood of submariners, but he never mentioned the rope. Maybe he thought no one would believe it. Maybe it was his way of guarding something sacred, something that belonged to the men who'd never come home. Years later, when the Bureau of Ordnance reviewed the post-war data on torpedo failures, they discovered a strange pattern. Boats that had reported unofficial field modifications, vague notes never detailed, showed drastically fewer circular runs. The reports were inconclusive, the language deliberately cautious, but buried in one memo dated 1945 was a single sentence written by a junior engineer. Some crews appear to have stabilized the gyro housing with non-standard insulation material. Effectiveness appears significant. No names, no acknowledgement, just that line. And somewhere in a warehouse in California, one of the Tang's recovered torpedo assemblies sat on a metal shelf, rusted and silent. Around its cracked housing, a fragment of oil-soaked rope still clung to the steel, darkened, frayed, but intact. It would take decades before a naval historian piecing through forgotten archives noticed the anomaly. The rope, the markings, the timing. In an oral history interview, one surviving machinist from another sub, the Cobia, mentioned a quiet chief who showed us how to keep our fish from killing us. When asked his name, the veteran paused. Haskins, he said softly. Ray Haskins. Never saw him again after the tang, but we all used his trick. Saved a lot of us. That simple piece of rope had outlasted the war, the men, and the bureaucracy that ignored them. It became one of those invisible acts that hold history together. Too small for textbooks, too human for politics. In the end, the ocean took the man who tied it, but not the lesson he left behind. Some say innovation is born in laboratories, but sometimes it's born in the hands of a tired mechanic, deep beneath the waves, under red lights and the hum of pressure valves, with only rope, faith, and desperation as tools. In the decades that followed, the Tang's legacy became both triumph and tragedy, a name whispered with reverence among submariners, but with an undertone of sorrow. Official reports praised the heroism of her crew, the boldness of Commander O'Kane, and the daring patrols that changed the balance of naval warfare. Yet no one ever wrote about the man who solved the problem that had killed so many before him. Raymond Haskins remained a ghost in the margins of naval history, unmentioned in citations, unnamed in briefings, forgotten by the bureaucracy that measured victories in tonnage and medals. But among the men who survived the war, his story endured. In the bars of Pearl Harbor and reunions held decades later in American Legion halls, veterans spoke of him quietly, like a secret they needed to protect. That rope, they would say, tapping their glass, saved more lives than most admirals ever did. They remembered his patience, his quiet defiance, his belief that sometimes the simplest fix was the truest one. They remembered the smell of oil and salt, the hum of pressure in the hull, and the way he tied each knot as if the ocean itself were watching. When naval historians later examined why the Mark 18's circular run issue seemed to vanish after mid-1944, they credited refinements in quality control and improved field maintenance procedures. But the truth was smaller, hidden inside a story that never made it past the torpedo room. It wasn't an engineer or a laboratory that saved those submarines. It was one man, one spool of rope, and the refusal to accept that a design flaw was fate. If you stand today at the memorial in Pearl Harbor and look out across the calm Pacific, you can almost feel it, the hum beneath the water, the ghosts of steel and courage resting below. Somewhere down there lies the Tang, still silent, her story unfinished. And perhaps deep in that darkness, one of Haskins' ropes still clings to rusted metal, frayed, weathered, but unbroken. A quiet reminder that in war, salvation often comes not from command, but from conviction, not from invention, but from instinct, and not from orders, but from one man who saw death coming and tied it back with a knot.